All right, we are on chapter 15 of I Survived Hurricane Katrina. So if you have been paying attention, Barry was just rescued by a woman named Nell in I don't know why I'm showing you this, there's not a picture. He was just rescued by a woman named Nell in a little tiny boat where she brought him to a bridge and just going to drop him off with he and Cruz. And he was kind of worried because he doesn't know anyone. There's just hundreds of families there. And there were all these voices that kept calling and asking for help as they motored on by. And Nell said that she'd be back to help them. And so this is kind of the experience that people were having, those who were surviving and able to make it on the roofs or in the waters, which I think most people had to get on top of something in order to survive. They had to wait for people just to drive by on a boat and hear them and notice them and get them to safety. So right now we have no idea where his parents are, Cleo and his mom and dad. We don't know if they've made it. We don't know if Abe survived and I think it was Abe's grandma or Barry's dad's friend that had the bar that he said he was going to keep open. We don't know anything about any of those people. Right now we just know that Barry and Cruz are on their way to safety. So chapter 15. Nell eased the boat onto the ramp that led to the bridge. Part of the bridge was underwater, but the middle part was high enough that it had stayed dry. Nell switched off the engine. "You'll be okay here," she said. "They're bringing people to the Superdome. Someone will help you there." Barry wanted to believe her, but he knew that even before the storm hit, there had been huge crowds and not enough food or water. What would it be like now? And besides, they wouldn't let him in with Cruz. Barry's fear started to boil up again. A man came running over. "Pardon me," he said to Nell, breathing hard. "I'm trying to find my grandmother. She's out there all alone up on our roof. I need to get her. "I'll take you," Nell said. The man nodded, wiping away a tear. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Barry knew he had to get out of the boat. Nell had other people to help, like she had helped him. Nell leaned over and put her hand under Barry's chin, lifting his face so he had to look at her. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked into his eyes, like she saw something there worth looking at. "You're strong," she said with no doubt in her voice. Barry didn't feel strong. His whole body shook as he got out of the boat. Cruz followed him. They stood on the ramp and watched as the man pushed the boat into deeper water. He climbed in beside Nell. Nell nodded at Barry, and he suddenly had the idea he'd never see her again. She powered up her engine and the boat pulled away. As Barry watched Nell disappear, her words echoed through his mind. "You're strong. You're strong." And soon it wasn't Nell's voice he was hearing in his own mind. It was his own voice. "I am strong. I am strong." Was he? He was scared. He was standing there crying, his legs quivering like skinny little twigs in the wind. But did that mean he wasn't strong? Barry thought about what had happened to him. How he had been swept off the roof and carried away. How he had grabbed hold of that tree and climbed up. How he had held on tightly against the wind and the rain. How he had saved Cruz. How they had made their way through the wreckage to that tiny dry patch of roof. He had felt scared the entire time. But here he was, standing on dry ground, in one piece. He looked up, and there was his bright star, Barry's star. And right then he knew that no matter how scared he felt, he'd find his way. Or someone would find him. An hour passed, and Barry heard a familiar voice. "Barry! Barry!" And then other voices calling his name, together, like a song. Dad reached him first, then Mom and Cleo, their arms wrapped around Barry, and they stood there together for a long time. The four Tuckers and Cruz, a tiny island in a huge sea. Okay, so this is a pretty quick and short chapter. He gets to the bridge. Nell is leaving him. She takes another guy to go save his grandma off of the roof. She tells him that you're strong. Barry questions in his own mind, is he really strong? And then that's it. Is he strong? He fell off of the roof at his own home, and then he managed to get up a tree. Then the house slammed into the tree. He was able to get into the house and rescue the dog that was there. So although he may have been terrified the entire time, the things he did were pretty remarkable. So I think he's realizing, like, everything that I did, it was impressive, even if it was scary. And then he hears the voices of his family. So they're reunited right now, which is really great because I was worried they wouldn't make it. And so now we are on Chapter 16, Saturday, September 29th, 2005, Riverside Park, New York City. Barry sat on a bench in the shade. Mom and Dad were standing a few feet away, watching Cleo climb up the jungle gym. Cruz was snoozing at Barry's feet. Barry had a sketchbook open on his lap, and he was looking at his new drawing of a Kivo. So he has Cruz with him still, and they're at a park. He had finished that morning, keeping his promise to Jay. It had been Jay's idea that they could still enter the contest. Jay had even called the acclaim offices from his grandma's house in Birmingham. So that's good to know that Jay did make it out and he was okay. I told him the whole story, he said. The man said we can still enter, and they want to meet you. Barry wasn't surprised to hear that. Even 4 weeks later, Katrina was the biggest story in the country. Every time Barry turned on the TV or got into a taxi with Mom or Dad, another voice was talking about the hurricane. This is the worst disaster ever to hit America. This is a national tragedy. A great American city has been destroyed, and everyone wanted to hear their story. The kids at Barry's new school, the man who made their sandwiches at the deli on the corner, strangers who overheard Mom talking at the bank, they all wanted to know about Katrina. They listened with wide eyes. If you paid attention at the very start of this chapter, they're in New York City, so they have relocated to New York City, which after Katrina, New Orleans lost a lot of its residents. They listened with wide eyes, and then they all said pretty much the same thing. They said the Tuckers were lucky. Barry knew that was true. Mom said it was a miracle that they had found Barry on the bridge. Some families had been separated for days or weeks. Some still hadn't found each other. And of course, there were people who had died, more than 1,000. They were still finding bodies in attics. Barry had nightmares about the storm. He didn't sleep much. Even the sound of Dad turning on the shower in the morning made Barry's heart jump. But yes, he knew he was lucky. Luckier than the tens of thousands of people who had been stranded for days in the hot and terrifying Superdome, or the people who had been stuck on bridges and highways and rooftops. A quick picture. Here is Barry in the park with Cruz, the dog, underneath the bench, as he's drawing a Kivo. The Tuckers had not gone to the Superdome. They had gone to Lightnings. So Lightnings was, which I just mentioned at the beginning of this reading, Lightnings is that, I'm pretty sure it was the owner of that bar that his father went to visit right before they left. Right before they tried to leave and then had to go back home. He said he was going to let people stay at his bar. Yeah, Dave and Lightnings. So yeah, all right. They had gone to Lightnings. They had stayed with Dave for 2 days and then caught a bus to Houston. Dave boarded up the club and went to Baton Rouge. By then, even he realized that the city wasn't safe. So everyone we mentioned at the beginning of this chapter has survived, except I don't know about Abe. The cousins in Houston spoiled them rotten for 1 week. Mom and Dad talked about moving there, finding an apartment nearby. But then a call came from the president of that famous music college in New York. There was a job for Dad if he wanted, teaching about New Orleans music. There was an apartment, too, with furniture and room for the whole family. A week later, they were here. Cruz, too. He was part of the family now. The Red Cross had helped Dad track down Abe and his grandma in Little Rock, Arkansas. Abe and Barry had talked on the phone, and Abe, the old Abe, had asked Barry if he would keep Cruz. He's not a killer, Abe said. I figured that out. They had a good laugh, and they cried a little, too, when they talked about their neighborhood. Barry hoped he would see Abe again one day. Okay. Sorry. So when he says, and Abe, the old Abe, had asked Barry if he would keep Cruz, what does he mean by the old Abe? So when we talked about it, Abe used to be his friend. He used to be a guy that would teach him how to play basketball in the park. And then, he went through some rough stuff and he ended up being a tough guy and kind of mean and maybe a bully and had Cruz and called him a killer dog and threatened to sick him on people. So the old Abe would be the Abe that was their friend, the one that taught them how to play basketball and what had grown up with them. Mom and Dad came over and sat next to Barry on the bench. Cleo waved from the top of the slide. Dad looked at Barry's drawing of Akivo. "That is really something," Dad said. "Thanks," said Barry, who liked this one even better than the original. Akivo had a sidekick now, a mutt with floppy ears, and he had a guardian angel, a beautiful fairy, and a yellow rubber raft. So now Akivo has a dog, so it's probably a symbol, symbolizing Cruz, and then a beautiful fairy and a yellow rubber raft is symbolizing Nell, the person who saved him. "He looks like you," Mom said. "That's right," Dad said. "I see it too." Barry stared at the picture, and he saw what Mom and Dad meant. Akivo's face. It did look something like Barry's. "I guess you feel a little like a superhero yourself," Mom said. "Nah," Barry said, his cheeks heating up. But really, he did. Out there in the flood, Barry had discovered some powers of his own. When it was time to go back to the apartment, Barry went to pluck Cleo off the jungle gym. He heard her singing On Blueberry Hill, and he smiled. Dad told Barry he had sung that song 1,000,000 times when they had been on the roof. Dad had jumped into the floodwater after Barry, but the current had been too strong. He'd fought his way back to Mom and Cleo. The three of them had waited out the storm. Mom said that Dad had called Barry's name so many times that he had lost his voice. They walked back to Broadway, Barry pushing Cleo in her stroller. Mom pointed out a bakery with a help wanted sign in the window. Dad said they should go to the Bronx Zoo later, or the American Museum of Natural History. "There's so much to see," Mom said. "We have plenty of time," Dad said. It was true. They had time, but not forever. Barry knew they would go back to New Orleans, where they belonged. When would that be? When would their city be healed? Barry didn't ask Mom and Dad those questions. He already knew the answer. One day. One day. And that's the end of the story. So we have a happy ending for them, and for actually every character that was mentioned in this story. So now I'm going to read the scene. It's called After the Storm. Questions about Katrina. There are a couple more pages here that just give you some facts about Katrina. For many years before Hurricane Katrina, experts had warned that levees in New Orleans were not strong enough to withstand a powerful hurricane. In August 2005, their worst predictions came true. Katrina's 125-mile-per-hour wind sent a gigantic wave of water from the Gulf of Mexico into the canals and lakes surrounding New Orleans. All of that water pushed up against the levees, and many of them failed, some crumbling like the walls of sandcastles. Billions of gallons of water gushed into New Orleans. Nearly 1,000 people drowned in the first hours of the flooding. Tens of thousands more were like the Tuckers, caught in a nightmare, struggling to survive as water filled their homes. Thousands of people were rescued from their rooftop and attics, often by volunteers like Nell. Nearly 50,000 were stranded in the Superdome in agonizing heat, without enough food or water. It took 5 full days for help to arrive, and another week before everyone was evacuated from the city. In the weeks and months after Katrina, many wondered if the great American city of New Orleans would ever recover. There was so much damage. Tens of thousands of houses were destroyed, as well as schools, hospitals, police stations, roads, and businesses. There was no electricity or clean water, and 80% of the city was covered with water filled with toxic chemicals and waste. The city's 440,000 residents were scattered all around the country. But New Orleans did survive, and years later it continues to recover. Building by building, house by house, tree by tree, road by road, family by family. 75% of residents have returned. To many visitors, the city seems as vibrant as it always was, with unforgettable music and food, beautiful buildings and gardens, and streets that bustle with energy unlike any other city in America. And that part's fairly true. We visited New Orleans after this, in 2013-ish, I think, and it seemed like the New Orleans we've always heard about. But in some of the poorest and hardest hit neighborhoods, recovery has been painfully slow. If Barry were to come back to the lower Ninth Ward today, he would see few of his neighbors smiling down from their porches. Much of the lower Nine is still abandoned. Only 19% of that neighborhood's residents have returned. I've studied dozens of natural disasters over the years. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and shipwrecks and blizzards and hurricanes. But none of these events made me feel as sad or as angry as I felt reading about the horrifying experiences of those who lived through Katrina. Why didn't our leaders do a better job protecting the beautiful city of New Orleans and its citizens? With so many warnings about the dangers of flooding, why wasn't more done to make the levee stronger? Why was help so slow to arrive to the survivors? As a writer of fiction, I could give Barry and his family a happy ending. But even after reading everything I could find out about this storm, I could not find the answers to these questions. And so that's an after address written by the author Lauren Tarshis. So Tarshis. And then facts about Hurricane Katrina. Get through those without crying. Let's see. Hurricane Katrina was one of the worst disasters to ever strike the United States. Millions of people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama lost their homes and businesses. The death toll reached 1,800, including 1,500 who lost their lives in New Orleans. So that's 1,800 people who died. More than 340,000 people evacuated from New Orleans before the storm hit. An estimated 100,000 stayed behind. Many of these people were too old or sick to easily make the trip. Others didn't have cars or couldn't afford the cost of evacuation, gas for their cars, train, bus, or plane tickets, hotel rooms. Some thought the storm would not be as bad as predicted. Among those who stayed was Fats Domino, the famous musician, then 77 years old, was with his family in their new home in the lower Ninth Ward. Like the Tuckers, Domino's house flooded quickly when the Industrial Canal levee failed. Mr. Domino and his family escaped into their attic. They were rescued the next day and spent the rest of the week at the Superdome before taking a bus to Baton Rouge and finally landing in Texas. His famous yellow house still stands, but it is in ruins. Katrina also caused a crisis for the animals in New Orleans. Pets were banned from the Superdome, and after the storm, few people were allowed to bring their pets on buses leaving the city. Tens of thousands of pets were stranded without food and water after the storm. In the weeks after the flood, the Humane Society of the United States organized the biggest animal rescue in history. Hundreds of volunteers from all over the country came to New Orleans. They broke into boarded-up houses, plucked dogs and cats from rooftops and trees, and even rescued pigs and goats. Many animals were reunited with their owners. Others were sent to shelters across America to be adopted by new families. Americans donated more than $1 billion to help the victims of Hurricane Katrina. Other countries donated too. The largest donor was the government of Kuwait, which gave $500 million. Hurricane Katrina was the 50th recorded hurricane to pass through Louisiana. And that is the end. If you listen to all of them, you have now read the book, I Survived Hurricane Katrina, and feel free to make comments about it and talk about it if you want to. I might mention it in certain lessons later, and that's it. I'll see y'all soon, because we all go back to school on Wednesday. I'll be back tomorrow, but students resume classes on Wednesday. So if there's a due date for Friday, that due date will be changed on the notes that I have given y'all. And so, yeah, just don't worry about the due date being Friday. But anything that's on our classwork wall will need to be done. Make sure you start working on it on Wednesday. A lot of people haven't even turned in stuff in the first week of school, and that was due the first week of school.